Welcome to Compact Murder from CompactHistories.com, where we take a look at real murder cases, assassinations and serial killers in short bite-sized episodes. This is episode 91, The Monster Butler. Archibald Thompson Hall was born in Glasgow on the 17th of June 1924. The son of a post office worker, he grew up in an ordinary household, but began stealing while still in his teens. What started with relatively minor offences developed into house-breaking and jewellery theft. Hall was intelligent, observant and ambitious, yet he showed little interest in earning the affluent lifestyle he wanted through legitimate work. Instead, he became skilled at identifying people who possessed money, valuables and social standing, then finding ways to gain their trust. His early criminal career eventually brought him to London, where he attempted to sell jewellery stolen in Scotland. The offence led to his first prison sentence, but imprisonment did not persuade him to abandon crime. Hall used his time behind bars to study the world he hoped to exploit. He learned about antiques, fine furnishings and expensive silverware, while also observing the manners expected in wealthy households. He reportedly took elocution lessons to soften his Glasgow accent and cultivated the appearance of a well-spoken, attentive servant. After his release, Hall adopted the name Roy Fontaine, inspired by the actress Joan Fontaine. The new identity suited the character he had created. Fontaine was polished, discreet, and knowledgeable about domestic service. He understood how to address employers, manage a household, and make himself appear indispensable. His ability to perform the role of a respectable butler gave him something more valuable than a set of keys. It granted him access to private rooms, financial information, and collections of valuable property. Hall moved between legitimate employment and criminal activity for years. He worked in domestic service, committed thefts, and returned to prison on several occasions. He also married, although the relationship ended in divorce. By the mid-1970s, he was an experienced offender in his early 50s, capable of moving convincingly between Britain's criminal underworld and the homes of the wealthy. Released from prison again in 1975, Hall returned to Scotland and obtained a position with Margaret, Lady Hudson, at Curtleton House in Dumfriesshire. Although he may initially have regarded the household as another possible target, he appears to have become genuinely attached to both his employer and the position. Lady Hudson trusted him, and Hall enjoyed the security and status of his new life. That arrangement might have offered him a route away from crime. Instead, the arrival of someone who knew his real history threatened to destroy the respectable identity he had constructed. David Wright was a former prisoner who had known Hall during an earlier period of incarceration. The precise nature of their personal relationship has been described differently in various accounts, but Wright certainly knew that the sophisticated Roy Fontaine was actually a habitual thief named Archibald Hall. When Wright appeared at Curtleton House in 1977, Hall helped him obtain work on Lady Hudson's estate as a gamekeeper and gardener. Bringing Wright into the household proved to be a serious mistake. Wright was unreliable and soon stole pieces of Lady Hudson's silver. For Hall, this was more than an offence against an employer he respected. The theft threatened to bring police attention to Curtleton House and expose his own criminal record. Hall confronted Wright, but Wright responded by threatening to reveal everything he knew if Hall reported him or attempted to have him dismissed. Hall now faced the loss of his position, his carefully manufactured identity, and the trust of Lady Hudson. In July 1977, he invited Wright to accompany him on what was presented as a rabbit-shooting expedition. Once they were away from the house, Hall shot Wright in the back of the head. He concealed the body beneath rocks in a stream on the estate, apparently believing that it might remain undiscovered indefinitely. The killing was not the result of a long-standing plan to become a murderer. It was a calculated response to an immediate problem. Wright possessed information that could expose Hall, and Hall decided that killing him was preferable to losing the life he had constructed. The act revealed how quickly his polished manners could disappear when his interests were threatened. Wright's absence did not immediately lead investigators to Kirtleton House. His criminal background and unsettled lifestyle made it possible for Hall to continue as though nothing had happened. Even so, the murder left Hall in a vulnerable position. Lady Hudson eventually learned that her butler had concealed his criminal past, although she did not know that Wright lay dead on the estate. Hall left her employment and returned to London. The name Roy Fontaine continued to open doors. In November 1977, Hall secured a position as butler to Walter Scott-Elliot and his wife Dorothy at their London home. Walter was 82 years old, came from a wealthy Scottish family and had served as Labour MP for Accrington between 1945 and 1950. Dorothy was considerably younger than her husband. Unlike his employment with Lady Hudson, Hall entered the Scott-Elliot household with criminal intentions. He had already killed to protect one deception. He was now preparing to use another deception to gain control of a wealthy couple and their property. Hall quickly earned the confidence of Walter and Dorothy Scott-Elliot. His experience in domestic service allowed him to appear efficient and dependable, while his knowledge of antiques helped him assess the couple's possessions. He understood their routines and gained access to areas of the home that would have been closed to an ordinary burglar. His position placed him inside the household, where suspicion was unlikely to fall upon him until it was too late. To help carry out the planned robbery, Hall recruited Michael Kitto, a younger criminal whom he had met through Mary Coggle, an associate sometimes known as Belfast Mary. Hall intended to steal valuable property and obtain money from the Scott-Elliots, but the scheme went wrong when Dorothy returned unexpectedly and encountered the men while they were discussing their plans. Realizing that she could expose them, Hall and Kitto prevented her from raising the alarm. Kitto suffocated Dorothy with a pillow, while Hall participated in the attack and its immediate aftermath. When Walter returned, the men gave him a mixture of alcohol and sleeping tablets, leaving him confused and heavily sedated. Their robbery had now become a murder, and Walter remained a living witness who could identify Hall. Mary Coggle was brought into the scheme to help create the appearance that the Scott-Elliots were travelling to Scotland. Wearing Dorothy's clothes and a wig, she could be presented at a distance as the dead woman. Dorothy's body was placed in the boot of a car, while the drugged Walter travelled with Hall, Kitto and Coggle. To hotel staff and casual observers, the group could appear to be an elderly couple accompanied by two younger men. After travelling north, they buried Dorothy beside a road near Bracco in Perthshire. They then continued into the Highlands with Walter, who remained under the effects of the drugs. Near the Glen Affric area, Hall and Kitto strangled him and beat him with a spade before concealing his body in remote woodland. Walter's age and condition meant that he presented little physical threat. His death served only to remove a witness and give the thieves unrestricted access to his property. Hall and Kitto returned south with jewellery, silverware, china and other valuables taken from the couple's London home. They had eliminated both of Hall's employers, but their attempt to disguise the crime had created further dangers. Several hotel employees had seen the travelling party, and Mary Coggle knew what had happened to the Scott-Elliots. She had also taken possession of some of Dorothy's clothing. Within days, Hall concluded that the woman who had helped conceal two murders had become another threat requiring removal. Mary Coggle's behaviour made Hall increasingly nervous. She had been seen wearing Dorothy Scott-Elliott's clothes and jewellery, including a valuable fur coat that could connect her directly to the missing woman. Hall and Kitto wanted the coat destroyed, but Coggle refused to surrender it. She also spoke to acquaintances about her sudden access to expensive property, drawing attention at the very moment when the group needed to remain unnoticed. Hall and Kitto attacked Coggle with a poker before suffocating her with a plastic bag. They disposed of her body near Middleby in Dumfriesshire, leaving it in a watercourse close to a barn. Unlike the carefully concealed bodies of Wright and the Scott-Elliots, Coggle's remains were soon discovered. A shepherd found her body on Christmas Day, 1977, although police did not yet know her identity or understand her connection to the missing couple. The two men continued attempting to sell property stolen from the Scott-Elliots. An antiques dealer in Newcastle-under-Lyme became suspicious when they offered valuable silver and china for far less than their apparent worth. He recorded the registration number of their car and contacted the police. That information would later help investigators trace the vehicle back to the Scott-Elliot household, but Hall and Kitto remained free for the time being. Their next destination was Hall's cottage in Cumbria, where they encountered his half-brother Donald. Donald Hall had recently been released from prison after serving a sentence for sexual offences against children. Relations between the brothers were hostile, and Donald began asking questions about Hall's activities and the property in his possession. Whether Donald genuinely intended to expose him or merely represented another complication, Hall decided that he could not be trusted. Hall and Kitto told Donald that they needed to practice restraining someone in preparation for a robbery. Donald allowed himself to be tied up, apparently believing that he was assisting them. Once he was helpless, Hall used chloroform to incapacitate him and drowned him in a bath. Donald became Hall's fifth victim in approximately 6 months. The killers wrapped the body and placed it in the boot of their car, intending to drive north and bury it in Scotland. Winter conditions made the journey difficult, however, and they stopped overnight at the Blenheim House Hotel in North Berwick. Hall had previously changed the car's number plates, reportedly because the original registration contained 3 9s, which he regarded as unlucky. The replacement plates did not match the vehicle's tax disc. That inconsistency, combined with the suspicions of the hotel proprietor, was about to bring Hall's series of killings to an abrupt end. The proprietor of the Blenheim House Hotel, Norman White, was uneasy about his 2 guests. Hall and Kitto behaved suspiciously, and White was concerned that they might leave without paying. He contacted the police and asked them to check the car. Officers discovered that its registration plates did not correspond with its tax disc and took the men to the nearby police station for questioning. When officers searched the vehicle, they opened the boot and found Donald Hall's body. Kitto was detained, but Hall escaped through a lavatory window. His freedom lasted only a short time. Police established roadblocks around the area, and Hall was captured near Haddington. What had begun as an inquiry into a questionable vehicle had exposed a murder in progress. Investigators soon began connecting the discovery to other suspicious events. The car registration recorded by the Newcastle-under-Lyme antiques dealer led them to the Scott-Elliots' London address. Inside the property, police found extensive signs of violence, missing valuables, and evidence that the couple had not simply gone away. The disappearance of Walter and Dorothy now appeared to be connected to Hall and Kitto. Mary Coggle's body had already been found in Dumfriesshire. Once she was identified, detectives learned about her association with the Scott-Elliots and traced reports of the strangely composed group that had travelled through Scotland. Witnesses recalled an elderly man accompanied by a woman wearing expensive clothes and 2 younger men. When the younger men later appeared without the couple, their movements took on a much darker significance. While in custody, Hall attempted suicide. After surviving, he began cooperating with investigators and disclosed the locations where the remaining victims had been left. Police searched in severe winter conditions, digging through snow and frozen ground. Walter Scott-Elliot was found in woodland in the Highlands, while Dorothy was recovered near Braco. David Wright's body was uncovered beneath rocks in the stream at Kirtleton House. The discovery at Lady Hudson's estate demonstrated that the murders had begun months before the Scott-Elliots disappeared. What first appeared to be a single killing involving a corpse in a car now extended across England and Scotland, with 5 victims linked by Hall's determination to avoid exposure. The geographical spread of the crimes complicated the legal process. Different murders had occurred under English and Scottish jurisdictions, making separate proceedings necessary. Hall and Kitto were charged in connection with the deaths, while detectives reconstructed a trail of stolen goods, impersonation, drugging, and improvised burial sites. Hall had relied on his ability to appear respectable and controlled. In court, that carefully maintained performance would be examined alongside the violence he had used to protect it. Hall and Kitto first stood trial in Edinburgh in May 1978 for the murder of Walter Scott-Elliot, whose death had occurred in Scotland. The prosecution presented evidence of the journey north, the drugging of the elderly man, and the concealment of his body in the Highlands. Both defendants were convicted. Hall received a life sentence, with a recommendation that he serve at least 15 years before being considered for release. Further proceedings followed in England. Hall was convicted of murdering David Wright, Mary Coggle, and Donald Hall. The charge concerning Dorothy Scott-Elliot was ordered to lie on file, meaning that no final verdict was returned on that count. Hall therefore received 4 murder convictions, despite his acknowledged involvement in the events surrounding all 5 deaths. Kitto was convicted of 3 murders and also sentenced to life imprisonment. At the English trial, the judge recommended that Hall should never be released. Evidence suggested that Kitto might eventually have become another victim if the pair had remained free. Hall's pattern was now clear. People who knew too much, behaved unpredictably, or threatened his position were treated as problems to be permanently removed. His victims were not selected according to one consistent type. They were employers, criminal associates, a former prisoner, and a member of his own family. The British press called Hall the Monster Butler and the Killer Butler. The names reflected the contrast between his occupation and his crimes. A butler was expected to be loyal, discreet, and trustworthy, yet Hall had used those expectations to enter wealthy homes and conceal his true identity. His knowledge of etiquette was not merely an eccentric feature of the story. It was one of the tools that allowed him to gain access to his victims. Hall spent the rest of his life in prison and made several suicide attempts. Successive decisions ensured that his whole life status remained in place, making release increasingly unlikely as he grew older. In 1999, he published an autobiography titled A Perfect Gentleman, presenting his own account of his criminal life and the murders. On the 16th of September 2002, Archibald Hall died following a stroke at Kingston Prison in Portsmouth. He was 78, and among the oldest prisoners, then serving a whole life term in Britain. His carefully created identity as Roy Fontaine had long since disappeared, replaced by the name given to him after his arrest. The case endured because Hall did not force his way into his victims' lives. He was invited inside, trusted with their homes, and allowed to move unnoticed among their possessions. The respectable butler had always been a performance, and 5 people died when they threatened to expose the man behind it. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Murder, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes, and consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactmurder.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, disasters, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/murdercoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.